Back in May of last year, a game called Captain Blood appeared on the Mac App Store. And looking through the preview images, two things immediately stood out to me. First, it looked like a fairly polished boutique indie game, the sort of release that you might describe as a AA or a B tier title. Second, it looked like it had been pulled straight out of the Xbox 360 generation, from the mid to late 2000s era of gaming. And my immediate reaction was, where did this come from, and how have I never heard of it? Given how few games of this quality make their way over to the Mac App Store, Apple is not usually this quiet when one does, but as far as I can tell, Captain Blood simply appeared on the store at launch with almost no fanfare. So not only did I actually want to play the game, I was also curious about its particular history. It turns out that the game was inspired by an early 1920s novel by Raphael Sabatini. The story follows Peter Blood, an Irish physician who is falsely accused of treason and ultimately sentenced to servitude. He eventually escapes with a group of fellow convicts, captures a Spanish ship, and becomes a successful pirate across the Caribbean. So basically the same origin story as the character you play in Skyrim. Except, there's no dragons, no magic, and of course you're a pirate. Okay, maybe it's a little bit different, but similar. Development on the game began in 2003 at Akela, a now defunct Russian game studio. Looking through the company's list of developed and published games, it seems like they had a bit of a thing for pirates. However, changing creative directions, shifting leadership, and changes in publishers caused the project to take much longer than expected. Although the game first appeared at E3 in 2004, it was not until late 2009, early 2010 that it received a dedicated website and finally seemed to be approaching release. However, tragedy struck in July 2010 when PlayLogic, the game's publisher at the time, filed for bankruptcy. Combined with the project's complicated ownership history, this left the game stranded, which was especially frustrating given how much of it had ultimately been completed. Over a decade later, in 2020, a new publisher called Sneg was founded by two individuals with connections to Captain Blood's early development. They began negotiating for the rights and working to untangle the ownership issues that had prevented the game from receiving an official release. In 2024, it was publicly announced that the game was going to be revived. Finally, more than 2 decades after development began, Captain Blood officially launched in May 2025 on PC, Mac, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. I purchased Captain Blood at launch through the Mac App Store. At the time, I played it for a couple hours, but between other commitments and a growing list of games that I wanted to play, it eventually ended up on the back burner. Now, more than a year later, I am finally playing through Captain Blood on my M2 MacBook Air, and honestly, I am having a blast. Well, a blast from the past, that is. Gaming from the 2000s is not remembered because every game was better. It's remembered because the design choices from that era are so immediately recognizable. Things like QuickTime events and elaborate heads-up displays and linear combat arenas, edgy protagonists, oversized weapons, unlockable costumes, fixed save points, button combinations, turret sections, and of course dramatic finishing moves. It was an era when games desperately wanted to feel cinematic, but they had not yet figured out how to imitate movies smoothly. They wanted to offer freedom, but they lacked the hardware and design conventions behind modern open worlds. They wanted to feel mature, which often meant grim color palettes, exaggerated violence, and aggressively serious protagonists. That awkwardness is part of what makes the era so memorable. And Captain Blood preserves that design language without filtering through modern nostalgia. This is not a new game selectively recreating the most appealing elements of the past. It contains the actual design assumptions of its time, including the ones that have since fallen out of fashion. It does have QuickTime events, it does have arena-based encounters, it has repetitive enemies, theatrical executions, broad characterization, and, obviously, an unmistakably 2000s understanding of what made an action game exciting. Playing it makes me feel like I'm back in the basement of my parents' house, crowded around a television with some of the neighborhood kids. Captain Blood costs around $30 Canadian on both the Mac App Store and on Steam, although it frequently goes on sale on the latter. At the time of recording, for example, it's currently 50% off. It performs really well on my M2 MacBook Air with 16 gig of memory. At 1080p, I get a locked 60 frames per second. At 1440p, it averages around 50, I would say. Controller support is also excellent. The game takes roughly 6 to 8 hours to complete, so at around 4 hours in, I'm about halfway through. There are a few replayability options. You can increase the difficulty, you can play through the story again, try to earn all the achievements, experiment with different combos and combat styles, and of course, speed run through the levels. By today's standards, Captain Blood is fairly short and offers limited replayability. For most people, it's going to be a one-and-done experience, but honestly, I sort of like that. Its compact length makes it far easier to experience than a modern 40-hour action game. In fact, I would love to see more one-and-done action-adventure games just like this. Modern games seem to keep getting bigger and more expensive, more elaborate, more complicated, and I sort of miss these smaller, more focused experiences. And at somewhere between $10 and $30, depending on whether you can catch it on sale, it's pretty hard to go wrong.
Not even saluting our arrival. Good old Spanish hospitality. So, you want to return the welcome message?
The inspiration and the history behind Captain Blood is fascinating, and I have a lot of respect for the people who worked hard to give the game an official release. After spending so many years stranded, it's nice to see that the project finally made its way into players' hands. More importantly, I am genuinely enjoying it. The dated mechanics and retro presentation are not things I need to overlook. They are a large part of the appeal. Playing it takes me back to when games were often smaller, stranger, and far less concerned with keeping you occupied for hundreds of hours. Affordable and compact experiences like this seem to be disappearing from gaming, but Captain Blood is a good reminder that an enjoyable game does not require a massive studio or ambitions of becoming the next AAA blockbuster. If retro-style action games are something you enjoy, then I recommend giving this one a go. And if you like gaming on your Mac, it's a bit of a no-brainer. We get so few native games on the platform that we have to support these surprise editions when they appear. The more we purchase native Mac games, talk about them, and hold Apple accountable for its lack of attention on gaming, the more clearly we can demonstrate that there is an audience here. And as the wider gaming industry continues moving toward digital distribution and subscriptions and cloud services, this is an excellent time for Mac gamers to make their presence known.